When you migrate from the old world to the new, the way my own parents did, countries in the new world, like the United States, just feel like brand new places. After all, America isn't even 250 years old, and some of the homes here in Leiden are much, much older than that. And it's here in the Netherlands that we pick up the next thread in the complicated story of how America was born. But to really understand what happened in this place and why it matters, we need to travel back about 1700 years to a time when the Roman Empire was in danger of becoming destabilized. The Emperor Diocletian, famous for his ruthless persecution of Christians, had decided to retire, and in the wake of his retirement, a number of powerful men made it their business to come out on top. The massive empire was already being ruled by a tetrarchy, a carefully designed system where 4 men shared power. But after Diocletian retired, a 5th man emerged in the city of Rome, a pretender to the throne named Maxentius. What happens next is one of the most important stories on the road to the birth of America. Although, it's going to take a little bit of patience and quite a lot of Bible prophecy to work it all out. In 312 AD, a man by the name of Constantine defeats Maxentius at the Battle of Milvian Bridge, and because his mother is a Christian convert, Constantine becomes convinced that the Christian God has smiled on him. So he brings the persecution of Christians to an abrupt halt, and he actually begins to favor them. Now, whether or not Constantine himself ever really did become a Christian is somewhat doubtful, but he did bring the church out of the shadows and elevated the Christian faith to the point where it became Rome's official religion. After that, Constantine pulled up stakes and moved to the east, where he founded the city of Constantinople. And that was the beginning of the end for the West. In 410 AD, the Goths sacked the city of Rome, and by 476, it was all over. The last Western emperor had been deposed. That left an incredible power vacuum in the West, because the Romans, who had been sent to the far-flung regions of the empire, started to head back home. The British Isles were left to be overrun by the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes, and the Celtic Gauls filled the vacuum in France. Bit by bit, the barbarian tribes that had conquered Rome became the modern nations of Western Europe. And at the same time, they started converting to Christianity, really starting with Clovis, king of the Franks, in 508 AD. So essentially what happened is that when the Romans began to pack up and leave their posts, the Christian church started to fill the power void that they left behind. So to this day, you can still find remnants of this period in the way that Christian churches continue to structure themselves after the ancient Roman government. For example, a regional administrative unit in the Roman Empire was known as a diocese, which came from the Greek word for administration. When the church was legalized after Constantine's victory, they too used the same administrative structure, organized by diocese. Then, in 533 AD, the Roman Emperor Justinian, the man who had built Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, well, he essentially handed the reins of power in the Western Empire to the Bishop of Rome, declaring him to be head of all the holy churches. And since the political Roman structure was gone, the church simply filled the void. And that's how organized Christianity became so politically powerful during the medieval period. Now add to that a clever 8th century forgery known as the Donation of Constantine, which was a supposed decree from Constantine himself giving the whole Western Empire to the church. Well, you can suddenly see why so many kings and princes found themselves bowing to the wishes of high-ranking clergy. What really happened is that the Christian religion had gone from being a humble, persecuted group to the most powerful political institution on the face of the planet. And as Lord Acton so famously put it, power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. It's painful to admit, but the medieval period wasn't exactly our most exemplary moment. There's a good reason that when the Black Plague hit and Constantinople suddenly fell to the Turks, that a lot of people started to suspect that this might be judgment for the horrible behavior of God's people. I mean, we were rooting out heretics and burning them at the stake, and you'd be hard-pressed to find Jesus doing that kind of thing. Down in Spain, we were forcing Jews to convert or lose everything. And while Jesus said, "Foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head," we were living like princes, buying and selling lofty positions in the church and generating fabulous wealth. So you've got to admit it wasn't our proudest moment. And of course, that's where the emergence of people like Martin Luther really made a difference. Just 25 years after Columbus landed in the New World, Luther stirred up all of Western Europe with a challenge to return to a more biblical Christianity. And thanks to another random coincidence, the printing press had just been invented, so the Reformation began to spread like wildfire. So what we've got as we begin the 16th century is a brand new printing press, the discovery of a brand new world, and a courageous monk who was willing to upset the apple cart. And all of that set the table for the emergence of a brand new republic, the likes of which the world had never seen. To really understand what happened, we need to wind the clock back even further, to a moment in history that few people ever give thought to. It's a story in the Bible that only takes up a couple of chapters, but proves to be ground zero for every political problem the world has experienced ever since, including some of the turmoil we're experiencing in 21st century America. The story goes that a deeply loved prophet named Samuel had been acting as liaison between God and his people. In a nation built on a voluntary covenant where God was the ultimate king and the descendants of Abraham were his subjects. Now, I can't stress this enough because it's really important if we want to understand how America was born. This was a voluntary arrangement built on a covenant that God established with Abraham and renewed with Moses at Mount Sinai. There was no king in Israel, at least no king but God. And in this story, Samuel the prophet is starting to show his age, and the Israelites are afraid that when he dies, they're not going to have any leadership. Now again, Samuel is not a king. He never passes any legislation. He's simply a messenger from God. But when he dies, who's going to take his place? They don't want his sons because they were absolutely corrupt, so they came up with another idea. All of the neighboring nations had human kings, and now that's what they wanted too. "Look, you are old," they told Samuel, "and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now make us a king to judge us like all the nations." And that was an unmitigated disaster because it was an outright rejection of the covenant and the sovereignty of God. And the Lord said to Samuel, "Heed the voice of the people in all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them." Now, what follows is a warning from God, a detailed list of things that kings normally do to their subjects, like impose high taxes or confiscate property or even use military conscription. "I'm not going to force you to keep me," God says, "but I think you're going to find that you haven't really liberated yourselves because, well, this king is going to make you serve him." And God was absolutely right. It was a disaster. It was a marriage of church and state that placed an awful lot of power in the hands of just one person. The first king, Saul, was a man who abandoned his faith and resorted to spiritualistic seances in order to run the country. Then you had David, a man that God really loved, but even he managed to bring a devastating plague on the nation through his disobedience. And then there was Ahab, whose wicked reign brought a 3.5-year drought, and finally, Zedekiah, a man whose wickedness was so legendary that it resulted in the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. It ended with God's holy city in the control of an actual heathen king, who took the Israelites prisoner and marched them hundreds of miles to the city of Babylon, where they were exiled for 70 years. They had wanted a king like the nations around them, and now they had exactly what they asked for. And in many ways, that's exactly what happened with the medieval church, because we also started behaving badly when we married church to state. Before the rise of Constantine, we had been a persecuted minority. But after he liberated us, we started asking him to settle the disputes of the church, like the Donatist controversy in North Africa, or the Arian controversy that led to the Council of Nicaea. What we did was invite a human king into the church, and what we ended up with was this odd mix of pagan Roman politics and the religion of Christ, which led to the bad behavior of the Dark Ages. Now, back in the case of the Babylonian captivity, God was careful to remind his people that not all was lost. As they slaved under the hot sun for their new Babylonian masters, God sent word through a prophet named Daniel that Babylon would eventually collapse. And he did that through a remarkable series of visions that managed to predict the history of the world somehow hundreds of years in advance. In Daniel chapter 2, it's a vision of a massive statue with a head of gold, chest and arms of silver, a belly and thighs of brass, legs of iron, and feet made of iron mixed with clay. It was a symbolic prediction of the world empires that would follow on the heels of Babylon. The head of gold was Babylon, which was succeeded by the Persians, or the chest and arms of silver. They, in turn, were succeeded by the Greeks under Alexander the Great, the belly and thighs of brass. Then we get the legs of iron, the Romans, an empire more than any other left its fingerprints all over the Western world. And finally, the feet and toes of the image made of iron and clay, which predicted a time when the Western Empire would be carved up among other kings, never to be reunited. Which is exactly what happened after 476, when the barbarians shattered the West and eventually gave us the modern nations of Western Europe, the toes of the statue. Then the final part of the vision is a stone that crushes the statue and grows to fill the earth. And what does that mean? In the days of these kings, the Bible says, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people. It shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. In other words, the decision to run with human kings was going to last a very long time. We will have to live with human government until the day that God sets up a permanent kingdom of his own. It's describing the second coming of Christ. And it's as if God is saying, listen, if you want to have a human kingdom, I'll let you have one. In fact, I'll let you have whatever you want because, well, I never intended to force you to take me as your king. But after a while, you're going to be convinced that human government doesn't have the answers. And I'm going to put an end to all the pain and suffering and establish a permanent kingdom where this will never happen again. It's a message that repeats itself several times in the book of Daniel. In Daniel chapter 7, instead of a statue, we see animals coming up out of the sea. Babylon is portrayed as a winged lion, a common symbol of the kingdom. Persia is a lumbering bear eating the 3 provinces of Babylon, represented by the 3 bones clenched in its mouth. Greece is a 4-headed leopard because when Alexander the Great died, his empire was divided among his 4 generals. And Rome is portrayed as a fearsome beast with iron teeth and 10 horns. And it tells us the 10 horns are the kingdoms that emerge from the broken empire, which is exactly what happened when the barbarians carved up the West. And again, the vision ends with human kingdoms and all their problems being swept away in favor of the kingdom of God. I was watching in the night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. He came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him. Then to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom the one which shall not be destroyed. But the saints of the Most High shall receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever, even forever and ever. Now, in this version, there's a new component, something that wasn't there in Daniel chapter 2. Among the 10 horns on the fourth beast's head is a little horn, and the description of this kingdom is anything but flattering. It goes to war with other kingdoms and makes exalted claims for itself. It persecutes people described as the saints, and it makes unauthorized changes to God's laws. And by the time we get to the most troublesome periods of medieval history, when the Black Plague is wiping out a third of the population, and Jerusalem falls to the Muslims, and Constantinople falls to the Ottoman Turks, a lot of people started to look at this prophecy and they began to ask a very embarrassing question. This little horn was a religious and political power that grew out of the shattered Roman Empire, out of the nations of Western Europe, and it was behaving very badly. It was like a bucket of cold water to the conscience. They'd been persecuting any number of Christian sects who didn't agree with them, from the Albigenses of France to the Waldensians of the Piedmont Valley. They'd gone to war against entire nations as a church, a decidedly political church. So they had to ask the question, is it possible that this prophecy could be talking about us? Is this 11th kingdom in Daniel our own Christian church? You see, they had noticed that Paul had warned us about a time in the future when Christianity would go bad. But know this, he wrote, that in the last days perilous times will come. For men will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, unholy, unloving, unforgiving, slanderers, without self-control, brutal, despisers of good, traitors, headstrong, haughty, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having a form of godliness, but denying its power. Is it really possible that Christianity itself would go off the rails? To those of us living in the 21st century, the answer seems obvious. Of course we did. From the Inquisition to the pompous claims we made about our own importance, to the way we used the power of the state to persecute people who didn't share our faith, well, it seems obvious to us from our vantage point today that something went very wrong. But back in the day, to admit that, well, it was staggering. It was a tough pill to swallow. Everybody from Joachim of Flora to the humanist scholar Erasmus and Luther, well, they were all coming to the same conclusion. God had actually predicted what was happening. So, the churches of the West suddenly had a lot of soul searching to do, and that unfortunately led to some very sharp disagreements about what should happen next. And it's at this point that some very serious religious wars took place on the European continent. Wars like the 30 Years' War from 1618 to 1648, which was fought between Catholic and Protestant princes. It's a war that may have killed anywhere from 3 to 11 million people. Protestants started pushing back against the persecution of Rome, but then in turn, many Protestants started persecuting people who didn't agree with them, like the Anabaptists, who were baptizing adults and were sometimes punished for that by being drowned. It was an unholy mess, and it all started the day we did what Israel had done. We invited a king to run the church, and that king was eventually replaced by a kingly bishop who sometimes behaved like the kings of Israel. We married church and state, in spite of the fact that Jesus specifically told us there should be no king in the church. Here's what Jesus said: "The kings of the Gentiles exercise lordship over them, but not so among you. On the contrary, he who is greatest among you, let him be as the younger, and he who governs as he who serves." We did exactly what Jesus warned us not to do. And to this day, that serves as rich fodder for critics of the Christian faith. Jesus originally told his followers, "By this, all will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." But when you look at our behavior back in those years, well, it was obvious that most of us stopped listening to Jesus a very long time ago. The Reformation of the 16th century was about a number of important ideas. It was a call to shake off some of the bad tendencies that had crept into the church in the centuries after Constantine. And it was an appeal to return to the Bible as the standard of faith. It was also a call in the face of some very public abuses to return to simple faith in Christ as the only means of salvation. But underneath all those changes, there was also a deliberate attempt to free ourselves from the king we'd invited into the church. And that proved to be a hard thing to do. Even after we'd overturned the idea that political power should be with a bishop who had risen to power because of the Roman emperor, even after we came to terms with that, we still had a very hard time letting go. So in the beginning, we tried to keep the marriage between church and state alive, except that we now did it on a local basis. That's what happened here in the city of Geneva, where my own family's long-standing religious tradition used to be headquartered. In 1553, the city government, which was clearly blended with the church, burned a man at the stake. His name was Michael Servetus. Now, the people who did this had condemned Rome for the very same kinds of things. Honestly, I think Servetus really did have some bad ideas. After all, he denied the divinity of Christ. But did that really warrant the death penalty? Word of the brutal execution reached the ears of a former friend of John Calvin's named Sebastian Castellio, and it moved him to start writing down some very important ideas, under a pseudonym, of course, because he didn't want to die at the stake like Servetus. And Castellio's ideas began to take hold in the hearts of God-fearing Christians. Now remember, this is just a few years after Columbus discovered the New World. So, what kinds of ideas did Castellio have? Well, they were the kinds of ideas that made a place like America possible.
Such conduct is not actuated by Christ, as it seems to me. For he did not defend himself by arms, though he might readily have done so, since he had at his disposal 10 legions of angels. The oppressors are actuated rather by the desire to defend their power and worldly kingdom by the arms of the world. This appeals from the fact that when they were poor and powerless, they detested persecutors. But now, having become strong, imitate them. Abandoning the arms of Christ, they take the arms of the Pharisees, without which they would not be able to defend or retain their power. When I see how much blood has been shed since the creation of the world under the color of religion, and how the just have always been slain before they were recognized, I fear lest the same thing happen in our day, that we kill as unjust those whom our descendants will revere as just.
To kill a man, said Castellio, is not to defend a doctrine, but to kill a man. When the Genevans killed Servetus, they did not defend a doctrine. They killed a man. That was the beginning of a very important idea, that people with different belief systems might actually be able to coexist. That it was time for Christians to let go of the power of the state and start just living like Jesus suggested. At the time, that was hard for a lot of people to accept because for more than 1,000 years, they'd taken political power for granted. If they disagreed with someone, they simply forced their opponents to change. And if that failed, well, they killed them. What you and I enjoy is a relatively new thing, an idea that came at a very high cost as the people of Western Europe sorted out what life might look like if the church was no longer running the state. They were taking the hands of the bishop off political power for the first time since Justinian had established the church as the political power of the West. That was a huge leap forwards toward one of the boldest ideas in history, a republic where church and state would actually be separated by law. And to get from Castello to the birth of America, we're going to have to figure out what happened back here in Leiden. And that's a story that almost defies imagination.